It's well after midnight, and you're talking to high-level business contacts in a hotel somewhere in the Gulf. As the 10th cup of tea is poured, the serious discussion begins. Why, your host asks, don't you Australians put more effort into making better business contacts in my country? Aren't you in the game? Look at those Americans, Canadians, and British. They're here all the time. It's not really hard. You just have to try. As you look at him, there's only one thing going through your mind. For an Arab to be so direct, even after 4 hours of polite conversation and 10 cups of tea, there must be a lot of frustration. Serious frustration. Quoting the former United Kingdom Treasurer and then Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Gordon Brown, from a speech he gave last year, there is an enormous amount of untapped wealth in the richer parts of the region, particularly Gulf sovereign wealth funds that could be easily accessed if the right structures were in place. In its latest major report, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission on Western Asia stated that the empowerment of the Arab middle class could carve a way out of the current development and governance debacle. In essence, the report concludes that the development of the Arab middle class can contribute to the development of stability and civility of government in the Middle East, North Africa, and the MENA region generally. But what does all that have to do with us and Australian economic opportunity? Well, we've heard these types of claims about our trading partners before, but this is different and similar to our recognition of our national interests by some 30 years ago, but instead venturing into Asia. Let me connect the dots. Australia has always been a go-ahead nation, eager to plot new courses, test ideas, take ourselves into the world to form new alliances, new friendships, and business opportunities. Traditionally, this has been with our old world European and US partners that have shaped our economic, cultural, social, security, and political progress. Over the past 2 decades, however, we have capitalised on post-European focus with establishing regional investment into China and Southeast Asia, who have a huge appetite fueled by a growing middle class. However, there is another potential partner in the Middle East and the North African region, otherwise known as the MENA region, and I'll refer to those two interchangeably. The MENA region has similar characteristics, which we as a nation are in real danger of overlooking to our economic detriment. Looking past the stereotypes of the region, we find a large middle class, strong urbanisation, and governments willing to modernise their societies. For example, trade with the Gulf alone already exceeds trade with the United Kingdom. And Australia is well positioned to capitalise further on this. We can increase our trade with the MENA region by tenfold, by going north into Asia and then left and turning left, maybe at Hong Kong, maybe in Jakarta, maybe in KL, but turning left to the Middle East. And I'm here today to get the ball rolling in this discussion. I want to start a conversation at the highest levels of Australian political, economic, and cultural decision-making about the importance of striving harder for closer relations between Australia and the Arab world. And then to spread that conversation to the Australian population in general. For despite the current upheaval in some parts, and I mean some parts of the Arab world, the Australian people generally have so much to contribute and so much to gain. And the conversation in the Gulf I recently had, well, I've actually had many such conversations. The moral from this conversation is easy to understand. The Arab world wants to do business and serious business with us. They really do want our trade. We think we are trying hard, but that's not their perception, as you would have surmised from my opening. We are hardly at first base. Others try harder, much harder, and therefore we must too. But why? Why put this bigger effort? Because the potential gains are immense, truly immense for Australia. The central fact calling for our attention to this task is something that has been happening gradually before our eyes in recent decades and has now reached critical dimensions. The growth of the Middle Eastern middle class. I repeat, the growth of the Middle Eastern middle class. According to the United Nations, this Arab middle class is now estimated at least 37% of the 380 million population of the Middle East and North Africa, or some 140 million people. Other measurements have the figure far higher, at almost 50% of 190 million. The countries of the Middle East, of course, I refer to are Algeria, Bahrain, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Tunisia, the United Arab Emirates, West Bank and Gaza, and Yemen. The current turmoil in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen may not allow such investment today. However, it is very much possible once the situation stabilizes. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here today to discuss Huntington's clash of civilizations or the rise of extremism. It's important to state that the overwhelming majority of the citizens of the Arab world are as horrified as we are by the violence caused by extremist minorities, and that they share our view that the best way to create peace and stability in the Arab world is economic development. Let us be clear, however, this is not to discount the multitude of issues and turmoil of countries such as Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, but this is not the entire Middle East. As these nations urbanize rapidly and seek to close the income and wealth gaps between their citizens, they know they're going to need significant levels of support to create the sorts of infrastructure and services that are commonplace in Australia and in the West generally. It means mega infrastructure projects of obvious interest to Australian mining, engineering, construction, vehicle manufacturing, and ICT companies, to name a few. For example, in the Gulf countries alone, 10,000 kilometres of railways will be built in the next 6 years for a total investment of $100 billion. Then there's Expo 2020 in the UAE. The FIFA World Cup in 2022, fingers crossed. And the other major building projects that I don't have time to mention today. It means the expansion of education services, health services, social services, ICT services, financial services, tourism, cars, trucks, trains and buses, and countless other forms of economic assistance that we as Australians can provide, that we have mastered, that we have know-how, and we have ability to deliver. Think about education. Right now, there are some 10,000 students from the Gulf states alone in Australia. 10,000 students from the Gulf states alone. And statistically, these students are more likely to purchase cars, entertainment systems, consumables, and travel more than any other migrant student group. And even if they're not personally wealthy, Their fees are guaranteed by the government. Today there are thousands of students in Australia studying mostly at master's and PhD levels under special programs. For international education exports, for Australian international education exports, it doesn't get better than that. If I were a Vice-Chancellor, this is my application by the way, I know what I'd be thinking. I'd seek to double it, and then I'd double it again. Going back the other way, into the Arab world. Did you know, were you aware that the University of Wollongong not only has a campus in Dubai, but is widely regarded as the most established and prestigious university in the UAE, with some 4,000 students and 200 staff? Ladies and gentlemen, it is not that hard. The Middle East is urbanising and fast. It's obvious that that's where we come into the frame. And our policymakers understand this. In February earlier this year, speaking on the appointment of Australia's new ambassador to Saudi Arabia, the Foreign Minister Julie Bishop said that expanding commercial links with Saudi Arabia, Oman, Bahrain and other GCC states is a key Australian government priority. Australia looks forward to the early resumption of the free trade agreement negotiations with the GCC. Recently, Trade Minister Andrew Robb said there is a strong fit between demand in the Gulf and Australia's strengths. They're right. Dead right. And the same applies to other Middle Eastern and North African nations. Put bluntly, here is a massive opportunity for Australia, an unmissable opportunity. But here's the point. We're going to miss it if we don't switch our attention to it urgently and go after that opportunity with the necessary scale and enthusiasm. Here's what I think our long-term goal should be: to take the scale of our trade with the Middle East and add a zero to it. I repeat, to take the scale of our trade with the Middle East and add a zero to it. It can be done because we've done it before. Think about it. He is part of the planet turning the corner, building an affluent middle class, lifting its mostly rural working class out of extreme need, improving social conditions, and trying to narrow gaps in the living standards between the rich and the poor. We could be talking about what happened in Japan in the 1950s and 60s. Indonesia since the 1970s and 80s. China since the 1990s, and India in the last decade. And Australia was part of it and benefited enormously from all of it. At every stage, our leaders since Menzies made the correct call: go north. But it wasn't easy. It's very easy to say, go north. Now, it's actually quite unremarkable. But to go north at that time, or to think about going north, we had to get over a lot of prejudices and negative stereotypes that dominated the way we thought about Asia for generations. It's not that long ago, ladies and gentlemen, that if we subjected even well-educated, perhaps well-travelled Australians to the ink blot test of using a map of China, India or Indonesia, the responses you might expect to receive are corruption, bribery, disease and poverty. We do that test today, you get Asian middle class and some stuff about cattle now and again. The transformation and the way we as Australians collectively think about this did not happen by accident. I repeat, it did not happen by accident. In just one generation, through purposeful leadership from all parties, we have managed to revolutionise popular attitudes so that Australians from all walks of life now see Asia not as a threat, but as an economic opportunity. Asia is no longer about the domino principle, but about the development principle. Asia is no longer about the domino principle, but the development principle. It is widely held to be a place for our iron ore, our coal, our financial services, education, health and food exports. It is a market that has helped transform our economy and give us a minor economic miracle. Actually, I withdraw that. Major economic miracle. 25 years of solid, just under 25 years of solid economic growth. Having succeeded in that, we need, as a matter of some urgency, to start changing popular attitudes towards the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. When people see maps of that region, we need them to see not the reflections of deeply ingrained prejudices about the Middle East, but rather places of economic opportunities for us. I guess the Americans, the Canadians, and the British have mastered that. We seem not to have done that at all. In its latest major report, the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia stated that the destabilisation currently overtaking parts of the region ultimately has its roots in the failure of the Middle Eastern nations to satisfy the legitimate economic aspirations of the emerging middle class. It said, and I quote, "The empowerment of the Arab middle class could carve a way out of the current development and governance debacle. Only an empowered middle class, the backbone of progress, democracy and prosperity, can challenge these destructive forces and broaden the horizons of Arab aspirations." It is on this, the Middle Eastern middle class, alongside the authorities controlling the sovereign wealth funds, that our efforts as Australians must be focused. By supporting the progress of people from economic precariousness to economic security, we will cut the ground from under the radicals while benefiting ourselves too, just as we did in Asia. So, my central message today is that we need our people to understand that Australia's future doesn't just lie north in Asia, but in a triangle that stretches to the top of the African continent. It's a go north, turn left message, kind of a triangle. I was always bad at geometry. We need equally visionary leaders to tell us to go north and then turn left. If our leaders in Australia, of all views and all persuasions and from all sectors, are looking for a big economic project to snap us out of economic negativity and reform conundrum, here it is. To use the terminology of the foreign policy establishment, having successfully explored many opportunities in Asia, we need to pivot. Remember that word, Barack Obama's? Pivot, not to Asia, we're already in Asia. Pivot to the Arab world and to the Gulf in particular, and explore those additional opportunities. We need to nurture that strategic space. We need to nurture that strategic space. And we need to start now. We have a strong basis to start. Let me give it in 3 points. First of all, think of our history and the ties they bring us. After successive waves of Middle Eastern migration, starting during the gold rush that brought the ancestors of the former Victorian Premier Steve Bracks and the former New South Wales Governor Marie Bashir, here to Australia, there are now around 500,000 Australians who identify themselves as having an Arab background. Successive waves include and brought to this nation the Maloufs, the Josephs, the Nassers, the Fahours, the Shahins and the Sultans, just to mention a few. The last census found that 250,000 Australians were born in an Arab country and a further 250,000 have 2 Arabic-speaking parents. With these people marrying and having children of their own in a very short space of time, there could easily be up to 2 million Australians with at least some Arab identity. 2 million Australians. It's no wonder, therefore, that country-to-country business links are being made and the rate of connections is quickening. Let me give you some examples. Right now, there are 400 Australian companies operating in the Middle East right now. There are some 300,000 Australians living and working there, many of them in very high income jobs, engineers working on infrastructure projects, accountants and bankers working in finance, doctors and nurses working in elite hospitals, academics teaching in the many universities springing out of the desert. Probably all of us here know someone who has lived or is living in Qatar or the UAE or Riyadh or Kuwait before returning home with the cash they've made to buy a home and start a family. The second reason for optimism is the fact we've got such a firm base on which to build stronger trade relations. Presently, Australia's trade with the Gulf states alone, plus Morocco, and by this I mean predominantly the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain and Morocco, is worth $12.3 billion. $12.3 billion. I suspect that this is a surplus in our favour, in Australia's favour. That exceeds trade with the United Kingdom, our forefathers, which is just 10.1 billion. And I suspect that this is in deficit to Australia. I say we buy more stuff than they buy of us. But Britain's population is just 64 million people. Less than that of the Gulf of 87 million. Less than that of Egypt of about 70 million. And 1/6 of the Middle East and North African nation as a whole, which stands at just above 381 million. The potential for trade with the Middle East to grow and to dwarf trade with the United Kingdom is massive, absolutely massive, and progress is indeed being made. Recently surveyed Australian exporters rate the Middle East as the most prominent up-and-coming market for themselves. As a result, orders in the region are expected to rise by 52% in 2015. So I want to talk about outlook. This is the equivalent of derivatives for stock traders. What we think is likely to happen. 52% believe orders will increase. That is a massive number. But we can't think that this is good enough, because it isn't. We have to believe and we have to understand that this is just the beginning. Ministers Bishop and Ministers Robb have become notable visitors to the region in recent times, making quite a splash. I'm sure the ambassadors will agree. And Australia is, of course, doing a sterling job, but they can't do it alone. Breaking open the Middle East requires the same national economic effort as breaking into Asia did some 30 years ago or more. It requires a change in our psyche, our Australian psyche, especially a change in our national attitudes towards the Arab world. And it needs to happen right about now. The third reason for my optimism is that the fit between our trade interests between the Arab world and Australia are so tight and so aligned. I've already mentioned the services, mining, construction, but what about other sectors? Today, in today's paper, just in case you thought I was some pontificating businessman with an academic bent, I want to provide you with some evidence that has appeared in the newspaper today. And if it appeared in the newspaper today, it must be true, right? So, in today's Australian Financial Review and Sydney Morning Herald, the mistitled article says, Iran deal opens door to avalanche of trade for Western firms. Now, that's just a hook to actually get it on into the media, because the article says nothing about Iran. I'm going to quote two parts of it. This is about Sunrise, Australia's largest rice producer and seller, and their CEO. Sunrise's sales to the Middle East have already surged 41% to 141 million in the past 12 months, and Chief Executive Rob Gordon expects more growth to come as sales extend to Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and even strife-torn Syria. They have to eat too. The branded rice market across the Middle East in 2012 was worth $4 billion. And in 2017, we anticipate it will be worth more than $8 billion. We as Australian rice producers are unable to supply that market fully when we're in the midst of our drought. But since we had Australian rice to sell, when we have Australian rice to sell, we'll re-establish ourselves as the absolute market leader. Sunrise Australia's last grain export monopoly has almost doubled its share in Saudi Arabia and Jordan to 60% and 30% respectively. Now you can read it for yourself in today's Australian Financial Review, but this is on the 29th of July 2015, and the opportunities are expanding, and rice is only but one in the agribusiness sector. Of course, the other one is tourism. Tourism is a no-brainer. And then there's the finance sector. Trade Minister Rob has recently pointed out that there are huge sums in the sovereign funds, funds in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and others looking for opportunities to invest in food, agriculture, and infrastructure. Think about the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which won the $5 billion Port Kembla and Port Botany contracts. This is on top of the $436 million they invested in an AMP property fund. The size of the region's sovereign wealth fund is staggering. Here are just some. The Abu Dhabi Investment Authority has $773 billion of funds under management, or FUM, as it's known in the industry. The Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency has $757 billion under management. The Kuwaiti Investment Authority, $548 billion. The Qatari Investment Authority, $254 billion, and so on. This comes to a total of the 7 Gulf states plus Algeria of 2.5 trillion US. 2.5 trillion US. To put this into perspective, if those numbers haven't bamboozled you, at last report, our sovereign fund, the Australian Future Fund, was worth $109 billion. Our sovereign fund had $109 billion. The sovereign wealth funds are not only huge, but they have very established relationships in America and European firms. There's no reason why we can't intensify our relationship with them to sell them financial products as well. Now I turn to the Islamic finance industry, in which I am involved, which has a huge future if we can tap this opportunity. Just like with Australian Middle Eastern trade, I believe we can easily multiply by 10 the amount of money from that part of the world that can be managed by Australian funds. In this way, we can help the Arab world grow as it helps us grow. A neat and compelling alignment of interests and mutual advantage. It is my sincere belief that to go north and turn left is part of Australia's national interest. And like Asia, will be recognised to be the case over a short period of time, despite the current hysteria in some media and political quarters. And this is why I spend my time to promote this message in forums such as this and in my various roles. At the Department of Foreign Affairs, Council of Australian Arab Relations. The Council, as you know, as you may know, was established by the Australian Government as an initiative to strengthen ties and promote mutual interests and a greater understanding and acceptance of each other's cultures, values, beliefs, and diversity. It's about promoting partnerships on contemporary issues of shared interest, not just in trade, but in fields like science, technology, the environment, health, sport, and social development. Number 2, the Australian Arab Dialogue. The dialogue has similar aims, and my intention for it is to become the preeminent private initiative for strengthening multilateral ties between Australia and Arab nations through leadership programs to be held in a multiple of cities in Australia and Arab nations. I'm currently organising the first dialogue to be held in the Arab world next year. And 3, as a member of the ASEAN Australia Council. the federal government's new body promoting similarly to the Council of Australia-Arab Relations, mutual interest and a greater understanding and acceptance of each other's cultures, values, beliefs and diversity, but in the Asian region. So I'm a strict believer in go north, turn left. Go north to Asia and turn left to the Arab world. Let me conclude with this observation. One that will be commonplace to those of you who, like me, shuttle back and forth to Asia and the Middle East and North Africa on a regular basis. Despite what images appear on our sensationalized television screens every night, no matter what part of the world we come from, we're all essentially the same. Australian or Arab, Christian or Muslim. Like us, most Arabs have never experienced violence firsthand. They see it on TV like we do. It's not part of their everyday lived experience. In fact, we could say their lives are in general very much like ours, lived for work, family, leisure and enjoyment. They love their children and their grandchildren, argue with their teenagers, support their football teams, are addicted to their iPhone and WhatsApp, look forward to their holidays, have their favourite musicians, movie stars and television shows. The negative stereotypes we have of each other, which are a result of inadequate human-to-human contact, are stopping us from benefiting from each other's good fortune. And the more we interact economically, and the more we interact socially, the more we will realise this. Like the people of Japan, Indonesia, India, and the people of the Middle East, they can help us and we can help them. Our economies can grow together, our middle classes can grow together. By helping create jobs there, we help create jobs here. We can be part of the solution to conflict and help build stability by advancing economic development. But like all grand endeavours, it needs effort, serious effort, and the right level of ambition. And as I have stated, I believe ambition should be no less than multiplying our volume of trade with the Middle East and North Africa by 10 over the long term, from $12 billion today, or thereabouts, to $120 billion. As someone who spent a lot of time in the Arab world, I know that Australia can benefit from taking that turn left at Hong Kong and heading towards Riyadh, Dubai, Doha, Amman, or Cairo, and the other great nations and cities of the Middle East. This is a topic that has been talked about in quiet corners for some time now, among trade and foreign relations experts, like the ones in the room with me here today. But it's time for the big public conversation to begin in earnest. In the run-up to the Australian Arab Leadership Dialogue next year, I'm up for that conversation, and I hope you are too. Thank you very much.